Hello everybody, welcome back. So, as we have talked about throughout the course, the fate of the New World was, from the beginning, intimately tied up in the development of capitalism. Right? We keep talking about the emergence, the disruptions, the creations of capitalism. And European colonists did not arrive on the scene as full-fledged members of a modern, capitalistic, especially not industrial, economy. But the larger processes they were a part of, the Atlantic world we've talked about, marked the first real development of the economic system that today we recognize as capitalism. So capitalism was here, so to speak, from the very start. However, that doesn't mean it took its modern form from the very start. And if we were to go back in time and visit the American Republic during and right after the Revolution, it would likely look rather different to us. But in the first half of the 19th century, the nation witnessed systemic changes in the American economy, which changed faster than ever before as the market and the spirit of capitalism became a more and more important factor than ever before in the lives of Americans. So we've spent a lot of time in recent discussions on the politics of the early republic, the revolutionary period, the people involved in constructing this new nation. Today we're going to step back and kind of take a larger bird's eye view, if you will, and we're going to start shifting things into the early 1800s. So the first step of this change we will be discussing occurred with the development of better river and ground transportation. During the first 2 decades of the century, new roads, especially, were built that connected the eastern seaboard with the backcountry and provided many farmers and artisans a greater capacity to sell their produce and wares. Work on the first national gravel road, for example, started in 1811 near Baltimore, Maryland, and connected the East Coast with the Ohio Valley by 1818. Consequently, for a while, Baltimore grew so quickly that it temporarily became the second largest city in the United States, surpassing even Philadelphia. Moreover, many states created companies that built turnpike roads that were paid for by tolls charged on the roads. Perhaps even more important was the new development of canals as routes of transportation. The most important canal was the Erie Canal, which you see a map of here, which was a remarkable enterprise initiated by the New York governor DeWitt Clinton, and it was finished in 1825. The Erie Canal connected the Hudson River with the Great Lakes, and it led to a very quick growth in New York's population, as well as the quick growth of cities near the canal. For example, lots of upstate New York cities, such as Buffalo, that you see here at the end of the map, right? These are places that spring up because of the Erie Canal. So consequently, New York Harbor became by far the most important entry point to the United States, because from there you could put goods and people on the canal and move them rather rapidly. Thirdly, steamboats made river navigation much faster, especially for sailing upstream. This was crucial to the Mississippi Valley trade. Before, the steamboat river traffic had mostly been one way. Boatmen built their barges upstream, sold them in New Orleans, for lumber, and then they actually walked back along the Natchez Trail to the Ohio Valley. But with steamboats, you could travel against the current, so it was a huge advantage. The first steamboat started operating on the Hudson in 1807. By 1826, a steamer could make the trip from New Orleans to Louisville, so upriver, right? Louisville being in Kentucky, in 8 days. These developments made both travel of people and of goods much faster and enabled goods and people to reach more places than they would have in earlier periods. This was also true of information, which could now travel much more quickly within the country. In the first decades of the United States, the National Postal Office used the new roads and riverways to transfer mail cheaper and faster. In fact, for most of the period before the Civil War, the Postal Service was the biggest government agency and constituted the lifeblood of American communications. No FedEx back then, or UPS. Indeed, for some people, the post office was the only real contact they ever had with the national government. Right? It was the only direct experience they had of this entity which they were told existed. But it was an absolutely necessary one for the economy, as information was crucial, as news regarding prices and other economic developments helped merchants and farmers make calculated decisions. Information also brought Americans together more than ever before, as they shared a greater awareness of the news from across the country and abroad, and participated in the political debates of the period. Moreover, the growing availability of information allowed more people to participate in the market and in politics, and had a democratizing effect on American society as a consequence. Although, as we saw and will discuss about more in the next lecture, this information was still for the most part monopolized by men, and this participation especially was nearly totally monopolized by white men. In any case, a crucial aspect of this new speed of information was newspapers, which became central to American life. National debates happened over the pages of newspapers, and people learned of local, state, national, and international news. Advertising was also one of the most important content aspects of the newspapers, as many readers learned about new local developments by reading the advertisements, which took up a substantial portion of the space in newspapers. So almost every town had a newspaper, even in the remote outposts. In fact, newspapers came to constitute the bulk of American mail during this period. In 1790, there were only 92 news publications. By 1800, there were 234, and by 1833, 1,200 newspapers. So we really see an explosion here in the development of newspapers. So not surprisingly, the transformation of American communications and transportation fundamentally rearranged the American economy, and as always, if the economy is rearranged, so is society. These changes had a lasting effect on industry, and indeed what we call the Industrial Revolution was facilitated and enabled by these infrastructural changes. Since the market delivered goods faster and to more people, some people had the foresight and the available capital to extend their operations. Before this development, for instance, the typical American artisan worked with several apprentices and journeymen who would one day leave the artisan to open their own business, to leave the artisan master to open their own businesses and become masters of their own. But now, some artisans tried to extend their operations by producing more and by dividing the work between their workers in a way that made production more effective and efficient. With time, some operations grew and started looking more like factories that produced large quantities of goods for cheaper and distributed these goods widely. These developments led to the disappearance of the older system of artisan shops and the appearance of larger production units. So industry tended towards larger factories that produced more goods more cheaply. This meant, however, that less people had the opportunity to cultivate an independent practice, and more people, consequently, became wage laborers. Take a shoemaker, for instance, who, with the assistance of an apprentice, would repair maybe 2 shoes a day, 1 shoe a day for every worker. By breaking up the production and having people complete very limited parts of the shoemaking process, the same shoemaker could have 20 employees and prepare much more than 20 shoes, perhaps 50 in a day. This would reduce the price of shoes and make that shoemaker more competitive. But in turn, it would drive other shoemakers out of business, who would then look for jobs as wage laborers for larger shoe operations. Likewise, some people with available capital started creating the first large industries of the United States, usually in the textile industry, clothes. For example, Lowell, Massachusetts, is the most classic example of the new industrial order. In the 1820s, several entrepreneurs pooled together $8 million, which was an amazing amount of money for that time in America, and constructed a mill town designed around a textile mill that would mass produce cotton-based textiles by harnessing water power and wage labor. Since the labor process was broken up to very simple tasks, the employers could use the cheap labor of young women who typically worked there for several hard years to help support their families, and later left the industry for married life. By 1832, textile companies comprised 88 of the largest 106 corporations in the United States. Now, as part of this transformation, American urban centers, cities, grew at an exponential rate. After the Revolution, many Americans decided to leave the farms they grew up on in pursuit of different lives. Many left because they learned of the greater opportunities in the city. Others wanted more freedom than their homelands were willing to offer them, while others left because their fathers didn't have any land to offer them and looked for other alternatives. This push to the cities, moreover, was driven by population growth increased by immigration. Between 1820 and 1830, more than 5 million immigrants came to America from Europe, particularly in the second half of that period, as bad harvests in Europe and a famine in Ireland led more than 4 million people to immigrate to the United States. Now, most of these immigrants came through New York City, and many remained in urban centers. So, if in 1820 there were only 5 cities with more than 25,000 people, and only 1 with more than 100,000, by 1850 there were 26 cities with more than 25,000 people, and 6 with more than 100,000. By 1860, New York reached the 1 million population mark. This influx of people arriving in cities enabled the rise of large-scale production and industrialization, as many people looked for and needed wage-paying jobs. It also allowed large-scale producers to find large markets for their wares. So this was a mutually reinforcing process. Now, this development of cities and the growing numbers of wage laborers reshaped American society. Urban centers like New York or Philadelphia saw the witness of what historians call a working class. And it's here that this clearly emerges in the United States, that is, for the first time. Now, of course, there had always been poor people, and had always been people who made their living by working for low pay. In fact, that constitutes, at least working, right, if not for low pay, since wage labor is a modern thing. But, right, poor working class people, what we refer to as poor working class people today, had been the vast majority of human beings ever since there were human beings. However, before you get what is usually called a working class, you need a large population of menial wage workers who see themselves as sharing similar problems and having common agendas. In other words, it requires a sense of a common cause. And this development is what we call class consciousness. The first working class Americans to develop this consciousness were the journeymen and apprentices we just talked about, who had once thought they would become independent master artisans. The growing realization that their futures were not as secure and did not hold much potential as they once thought generated a lot of anxiety and led them to band together to demand better working conditions and to try to challenge the economic developments of the day. These were people, in other words, who the bargain of having racial and gender status above women and non-whites was not enough. That did not mean that they rejected those markers of status. Most of the working class was very racist and sexist. But it does mean that they decided to band together to demand more on the economic side of things. Therefore, in the 1820s and 1830s, beginning in Philadelphia and New York, working men formed political parties to pursue their interests. And they fought for such causes as education, abolition of prison punishments for debts, limiting work hours, and securing workers' pay and hard money. Workers also organized in their workplaces in unions and sought to wrest better conditions from their employers by organizing strikes and bargaining collectively. In 1835, for example, a 3-week strike occurred in Philadelphia, in which most of the menial workers of Philadelphia participated. After 3 weeks, they won a concession for a 10-hour workday. This usually meant work from 6 to 6 with 2 one-hour breaks for meals. Of course, hold on a moment. I'm going to have to slip through this from a previous class. Of course, if this time period saw the emergence of a class-conscious working class, other classes developed in the cities as well. And the most powerful, not surprisingly, were the rich upper class that was comprised of large merchants, owners of companies, and large bankers. While we have no clear data regarding the disparity of wealth in America at this time, we do know that in cities the stratification of wealth was larger than elsewhere. In 1840, in the large American cities, only 5% of the male population accounted for about 70% of the wealth and property. Meanwhile, however, the cities also saw the growing significance of the middle classes, constituted primarily of families with male providers in professions such as lawyers, bankers, doctors, and many more. And their wives almost never worked. That was almost a marker of middle class status, right? It's very rare for middle class women to work. Just leave it there. Many of the politicians of the period came from a middle-class background, and while they did not necessarily hold most of the wealth, they held significant influence as important figures in politics and arbitrators of American values. So they were very influential culturally, the middle class. The development of all these new class arrangements resulted in new formulations of who was regarded as worthy of social respect and power. If once, as we saw, the most important divide was between gentlemen and commoners, or the people indoors and the people out of doors, in this period, particularly in urban centers, a new dividing line developed between people who worked in menial jobs and those who worked in office jobs, between working class and middle class people. Another way you can think about this is blue collar and white collar. So, for example, during these years, clerks became central to the economy and consequently became a respectable position for young men. Now, a clerk, which is the term they used at the time, is basically a secretary. And although many of these wage laborers as clerks did not earn substantial wages, at least at first, their presence and occupations in law offices, banks, and merchant offices, working, right, as clerks, secretaries, offered them more prospects for the future than menial laborers. So, if menial laborers belonged to the working class, clerks who did not do menial labor were not part of the working class, even if they weren't paid all that great at first, because they were viewed as having a possibility of rising in society and becoming more financially secure than menial laborers. They used their positions as these clerks often to build their social networks and increase, right, the probability of them moving up the economic ladder. So this position carried social significance, and Americans viewed office jobs much more positively than menial or working class jobs. And this is what divided the working class from the middle class during this period. It was not always, usually it mapped onto income, but it was not always or exclusively about income, but also about social status and whether or not you were viewed as being capable of rising fully into respectable middle class society. But all of this was built on an economic foundation that could, at times, be rather shaky. Another new phenomenon that Americans experienced at the time was the convulsions of a capitalist economy that experienced periodic times of growth coupled with frequent downturns or recessions. For example, the first modern panic, as historians call it, occurred in 1819, which lasted 3 to 4 years. By 1819, Americans had become so intertwined economically that when hard times came, they came for the whole economy. So there's this ripple effect, right, where you can no longer contain a downturn in just one portion of the economy. It affects everybody. Such sudden convulsions came out of too rapid growth or out of the burst of speculative bubbles, and the suddenness and reach of their impact was a new experience for most Americans. Another example of this occurred in 1837 when, after a long period of boom, an even bigger panic or bust hit America. This bust period had international dimensions and demonstrated the involvement of the American economy in not just a national, but an international and global market. This time, a second panic hit America right after the first had subsided, 2 years later in 1839. Finally, after 6 years of an economic bust period, by 1843, the economy entered a recovery period. But during this long period, some of the biggest banks in the United States and the biggest corporations went bankrupt. So this was also a fairly unstable system that could impact everyone, not just the working class, if busts were big enough and the downturns they caused lasted long enough.